And I'm going to say something that many people probably don't know and many people probably aren't doing, is that your training, whether you're in a surplus or a deficit, shouldn't really change. Got a couple of things today that I haven't really covered in mass detail. I kind of mentioned one of them, but there's one that I haven't really discussed. And that's going to be firstly, training on a cut or training in a deficit period and how you'll probably do it wrong. And also ice baths and why you're being a bit of a sausage with them. To do that, we're going to look at LeanBeefPatty's video, leg day on a cut. We're going to look at the leg day and we're going to talk about both those things I've just addressed. But as always, there's going to be a catch. If at any point you actually just learn something from this video, be that about training on a cut during a deficit or ice baths or even leg day training, I'd really appreciate it if you did subscribe to the channel, as it does help me out a lot and it makes me believe that I don't really need friends when people on the line think I'm tolerable. Only if you learn something. If you don't learn something, dislike the video, leave a nasty comment, and I'll probably have nightmares about it tonight. I'm skipping the warm-up because quite frankly there's not a lot to say there. Yes, you should warm up before exercise. Is there a singular right way to warm up? No. You could do some dynamic stretching, you could do some low intensity cardio. We're on the treadmill for 5 to 7 minutes. Whatever you choose to do is up to you, but what I would say is try and get a few warm-up sets of a movement in before you start. So for example, that might be 2 or 3 warm-up sets of leg press, for example, before going into your working weight, as LeanBeefPatty is doing here. So firstly, leg press, love it, great movement. Do you need to leg press? Absolutely not, but I do think it's a bloody good. The one thing LeanBeefPatty is doing really well here, which many people don't do, is firstly, warming up in the movement. You see she was warming up on that set, but look at her range of motion, especially when you're looking at a quad bias leg press, which she is doing here, where her feet are quite low and narrow. Look how low she's going. We call that peak run. Look at that. So firstly, her bum is planted on the pad at all times. She's not sacrificing her bum coming off just to get extra range of motion. All that's going to do is when your bum lifts off, it's just going to put a lot of pressure on your lower back, and that's not going to be very nice. What we want to do is pull yourself into the machine as she is doing here. Keep the bum planted and get as low as you can. Again, the big thing when looking at quads, especially on the leg press, is knee flexion. So how much the knees are bending. The more knee bend means the more quads, and we like that. Intensity is good, but to be honest with the leg presses, what really holds people back mainly is actually fear, because obviously the weight's coming down like in front of you. You feel like you're going to get crushed, when in reality, you're probably able to push it a lot harder than you think. Leg presses often also have safety pins, which I believe is what this is here, where you can set a stopper to prevent you from getting crushed. So I'm just saying there's probably more in the tank there. The pendulum squat is fantastic. It's a great length and position dominant movement, and honestly, a lot of people have this idea that they need to back squat. I haven't done a barbell back squat for years. I much prefer a pendulum squat. Reality is when you're back squatting, there are going to be other variables that may hinder your ability to train the legs sufficiently to failure, which could be like your core, your breathing, whatnot. Those are less of a concern on a pendulum squat. What I would say is her foot position, especially if you're doing this to target the quads, which you probably should be if it's a pendulum, is a bit off. You see how the knees, although sure they're bending, they're not traveling very far. And that lack of knee travel does indicate that the quads probably aren't being as utilized as they could be. So to combat that, again, depending on mobility and range of motion allowances, we essentially just bring the feet a bit lower, which then allows the knees to travel further, thus lengthen the quads a bit more, thus shift a bit more emphasis over to the quads. Whereas there's an argument that if your knees aren't traveling as much, you might consider the glutes might be a little bit more involved, and also maybe the adductors as well. Whereas with a movement like this, you probably do want to favor the quads. Hip thrust is a banging movement. Honestly, it's fantastic. It's a great short-term position glute movement. It's actually relatively simple. What you essentially want to try and do is keep your shins as vertical as possible. As soon as they start shifting forward or back, you know other muscles are going to jump into the mix, when if you want to keep more tension on the glutes, a bit more vertical on the shins, yes, they are going to travel back slightly towards the bottom of the movement, but you maybe don't need to go as low. Again, I think her range of motion here is fantastic, but it really depends on the person. You may not want to go as low, or you may actually want to go lower, so it depends. Leg extensions are very common in most leg days, it seems, and I'm not mad about that, because I literally said in I think in the last video how I think leg extension is one of the few movements most people should probably be including in at least one of their leg days. So I'm not really going to say much there, other than the fact that you can't really cock it up, because the reality is you're just extending the knee. A lot of her reps do seem to be a bit higher. I do think there is a place for obviously higher reps, depending on the person, the goals and whatnot. Most of my work, like the majority of my training, is usually in the 5 to 10 rep range, because quite frankly, if we know that 5 reps to failure and 30 reps to failure will yield the same stimulus regarding effective reps and same stimulus of growing muscle, then reality is, why do you need to do more reps than that? The only time I personally prefer maybe favoring higher reps, like 12s, 15s, potentially, not all the time, but occasionally I might throw it in, just for variation, if clients want something a bit different, because looking at 5 to 10 on the program might be a bit boring for them and they might want a bit of variety. And sometimes if I'm not feeling too great and I've got a bit of like a bit of a niggle, then I might go to a slightly higher rep range just so there's less joint loading, especially if I'm dealing with something that's causing me a bit of bother. But I would still say the majority of my work is in the 5 to 10 rep range, because quite frankly, additional reps is probably just going to yield additional fatigue for no additional result or no additional stimulus, and that's not really the best trade-off. Again, just opinion, just preference. Like I said, there is a time and a place for slightly higher reps, but it seems like most of her work does favor that higher rep range, whereas I'd probably go the opposite, whereas most of it would probably favor a lower rep range. I mean, yeah, leg curls. Again, you can't really cock this up too much either, because you are just flexing the knee. If I could only choose one hamstring variation, it would probably actually be the seated leg curl. What I would say is just make sure you're holding on, either hold on the handles or lean forward. Actually, that's a bit of a tip. But what I would say is actually if you lean forward slightly, that may actually further lengthen the hamstrings, which you might find to be quite enjoyable, because it may potentially increase the effectiveness of said movement, especially it being a lengthened position dominant movement. But yeah, seated leg curls, banging, love the movement. Link down below, you've got the link to work with myself on a one-to-one basis where I can help coach you towards your goals online. You've also got the link to join the TFNL group coaching application, which you can do either at home or at the gym, which costs less than $1 a day to have a bloody good program written for you. And you can talk to me about stuff as well, because there's a message board on there. And you've also got the link to the TFNL workout guides, which, to be honest, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, are pretty bloody good. So I encourage you just to tickle the links down below and even just have a little gander, do some window shopping, and let me know your thoughts. Ice baths. This is an interesting one. I've spoken about this before. The reality is there's a lot of research basically coming out that for recovery and stuff, sure, maybe there's a purpose. If you enjoy them, sure, maybe there's a purpose behind ice baths. Like at the end of the day, if you enjoy it, who am I to say there's no purpose there? I'd also say if you enjoy an ice bath, then let's bring that to a room. There's something to discuss here. When it actually comes to like building muscle and whatnot, ice baths are actually going to reduce inflammation, when in reality you actually kind of want inflammation. Thus, adopting ice baths into your routine, or like cold therapy or whatever it may be, could potentially slow your rate of progression and hinder gains. And in reality, that may not be what you want. So all I'm saying is probably wouldn't ice bath myself unless you really enjoyed it and maybe it was good for your mental health. That's just my preference, because again, my priority right now is just kind of optimizing my training, and this may actually hinder my training or the results I get from my training to some extent. Another thing I want to quickly mention is training in a deficit period. So in a weight loss or fat loss period, training during that period. And I'm going to say something that many people probably don't know and many people probably aren't doing, is that your training, whether you're in a surplus or a deficit, shouldn't really change. Like genuinely, it shouldn't really change. Intensity stays the same, movement selection stays the same. If anything, I might potentially do slightly less volume in a deficit because it's much easier to maintain muscle than it is to gain muscle. For the sake of fatigue and recovery, especially when I have less calories to help me recover, I may do a little bit less volume. Why does it need to change? Why does your training need to change? I'm a big believer in the best way to maintain muscle during a deficit period is actually by maintaining your strength, or actually arguably potentially even getting stronger. We know that gaining muscle and building muscle is not a fuel-driven process. It's a signal-driven process. So although it is easier to drive that signal when in a surplus due to the additional calories and fuel, you do not need to be in a calorie surplus to build muscle. Earlier on in your training, it's going to be much easier to do that. Later on in your training, it's going to be much harder to build muscle without being in a surplus. But what I would say is maintain your strength, and if you can, get even stronger. And that's probably going to help you to potentially build muscle in that deficit, but at least hopefully maintain muscle in that deficit. And a lot of people, this is going to sound quite harsh, but it's true. A lot of people get to the end of their deficit and say, oh, when I finished dieting, I lost so much muscle. You argue, did you actually lose so much muscle, or did you actually not have as much muscle as you thought to begin with, and it was only apparent when you became leaner? Something to ponder. But honestly, surplus or deficit, your training doesn't really need to change. Just like all my videos, this is simply my opinion, and I'd love to hear your opinion in the comment section below. Do you like ice baths? And if you do you want to talk about it? Thank you for tolerating me. Thank you for tolerating my waffle about many bits and bobs, and thank you for tolerating the video.